So I'm going to talk a little bit about wildlife in oak woodlands. And so in Indiana, our oak woodlands are actually pretty similar in a lot of ways to Missouri from an ecological standpoint. And so it really translates quite well. We don't probably have some of the uh, barrens and savannas that the Missouri has, and we probably have a little bit higher site index and productivity, but otherwise it's actually quite similar. So if you're starting to think about, what kind of animals can utilize my property, you really kind of have to think big before you get down into the weeds, right? And so just like our government system, everything that we do as a property owner is influenced by those constraints and rules the higher up you go, okay? And the same is true with natural systems. And so where you are in the landscape is really important. And this is true in terms of grassland wildlife, but also woodland wildlife as well. So in other words, if you're managing for woodland animals, oftentimes for many of these species, if you're in a forested landscape, you're going to have different results and different opportunities to see animals as opposed to being in a more fragmented landscape. But that's just to think about that and from that standpoint. But really, from the property standpoint, that's really what I'm going to focus on. So the way I approach this is I'm kind of making a checklist, right, in terms of kind of things that we can do and manage on properties to affect wildlife. And the first one is the age of the woodlands, the stand, right? And so how does that influence wildlife? So many of you have probably seen this type of a graphic before. They're pretty commonly used in extension publications and other publications about woodland and wildlife management. And so really in woodlands and a lot of habitats, we're going to manage succession. And so we need the young stuff, and then we also need the old stuff, and we need stuff in between, right? And so that's going to provide habitat for a diversity of wildlife species. Now, if you probably can't read the species on there, and they always tell us never to do that, but think of it this way, that we have some specialists out there that really require a very a particular type of habitat, and without it, you're just not simply going to have them, regardless of the landscape context. But we also have species that are either habitat generalists or have multiple different types of successional stages that they require. And so those species really require more hands-on active management so that you're constantly providing those types of habitats for them. A good example of that is the ruffed grouse. And so ruffed grouse is a game species throughout much of eastern United States. However, actually in Indiana, it's actually an endangered species now. They took it off of the list because it wasn't doing so well. And really the reason why is habitat. And so ruffed grouse require mature woodlands for nests. And so females will often lay nests right up against the base of a large tree that provides protection from them. And then they can see all side to side in front of them for predators. And so they can blend in quite well. And that's really how they do that. They nest right on the ground. But they also need other stuff. And so they need very young woods with structure that the males will use for drumming. And so this provides them protection from birds of prey that can't really fly through that very efficiently and provides them good cover. Of course, they also need brood cover. And so brood cover and habitat is going to be more little older woods than this, but also old fields and things that have a lot of insects, have a lot of soft mass fruits, those kinds of things. And so it needs those diversity of habitats. And so the way we do that is through timber harvesting. And so Mother Nature has done this through things like tornadoes, straight line windstorms, fire, although Native Americans certainly did a lot of prescribed burning and things, purposeful burning that really affected our forests. But today, mostly what we do to affect the age of a stand is really done with timber harvesting. And so cutting different size openings is going to change the structure, the age, and set back that age of that woodlands, and you're going to get wildlife to respond accordingly. Okay, so one type of forest, age of a forest, isn't necessarily better than another age. They just have different species compositions, different structural compositions, and you're just going to get wildlife that are going to respond to those changes. So this is actually a 10-acre clear cut on the hardwood ecosystem experiment in southern Indiana. And so you notice as a result of that harvest that there's a lot of down woody stuff there. And so that's actually intentional because they did this to try and mimic more natural disturbances. But certainly the loggers took out all the marketable lumber from that as well. But in much of the central hardwood systems, though, is that these change very rapidly. And so that's actually me. I'm a little over 6 foot tall. And so this is that same harvest site. And this is 6 years post-harvest. And so you get actually quite a lot of growth. And so these change very dramatically year 1 to year 2 to year 3. And then that rate of change is going to decrease over time. Okay, but these are really beneficial. You have high species diversity here, not only plant, but you get different species of wildlife. So just as an example, I know Frank Thompson's going to talk probably a lot about this in terms of woodland songbirds and those kinds of things, but you can look at benefits to other wildlife, for example, white-tailed deer. And so this was from some work down in southern Indiana by a colleague of mine, Jared Brook, a few years back. And so they measured deer forage, which is basically, if you think about deer, they live from 5 feet above ground down to ground level. That's where they're going to be eating, right? And so they looked at mature forests. They looked at different types of timber harvesting, from group selection to shelter wood, which are removing part of the canopy, and it's done in different stages, and then a clear cut, which is just removing all of the overstory trees. And they found significant more available browse for deer to eat in all three of those. And so the group shelter wood and clear cut weren't different from each other, but all three of those had significantly more pounds per acre of deer forage than mature forest. Okay. And so that's really the only way you get that. So the idea there is we're actually providing all these young shrubs and trees, and it really can overwhelm deer, and they can respond from that standpoint, right? The neat part is though, whoops, that was an accident. Sorry. Is that this is also a good way to regenerate oak. And so there's a lot of research done on how to regenerate oak. So it's kind of a win-win standpoint from maintaining that oak component as well as the deer. So depending on where you're at in the deer browse pressure, larger openings are going to be better because, one, you've got a lot more forage. Okay, so the deer can't really impact as much of the area as they would on very small openings, and two, you get more sunlight, more possibility to regenerate oak. So it really depends on what's going on there. So that's really, think about the age, the stand age. That's one thing we can think about. And so having those different ages of woodlands within your forest can really be beneficial. So the next thing to think about is the species composition. I'm referring to just the overstory and mid-story trees in this regard. Okay, so what kind of species we have? And so we're here in this seminar, and we're interested in oaks. And so oaks, as you probably know, are white oak and red oak. And so from a wildlife standpoint, it's really good to have a mix. White oaks tend to have less tannins than red oaks, so they're more preferred by species. But the problem with white oaks is a lot of them are kind of boom bust. And so you might have a good acorn crop in 1 year, but maybe the next 2-3 years, not so much. So you want to kind of buffer that by offering not only white oak, but also red oak type species. And the other thing to think about with that, getting that diversity, is you also get a diversity of size of acorns, right? And so some things are small. So some woodpeckers, some other birds, they would actually prefer some of those smaller acorns like pin oaks and those kinds of things, as opposed to large, northern red or some of the other bur oak, those kinds of things. And so having that diversity really helps, not only from a phenology of when those acorns available, but also the size of them as well. So how much is enough? So there's actually a couple ways to do this. I know there's some scouting things that you can do that's not exactly, some of it's pretty intensive work. I'll just leave it at that. So one quick way to do that is, if you're having some inventory done, a forest inventory, you're going to have a basal area of on a per acre basis, right? And so if you've got a basal area of, say, around 80 or so, then you've got a really good, and this is just oaks, right? And so you've got a really good potential for acorn production there. So that's kind of a quick and dirty way to do that. And it's also something that you might be doing anyway, so you can just gather that information. So from a wildlife perspective, if you've got a basal score of 80 or so of oaks, then you're probably doing pretty good. That doesn't necessarily capture it all, though. So the size is important. And so you want mid to large size oaks. Those are going to produce the most acorns. And just like people, as they get older, they tend to kind of not be as efficient. And so their rate actually decreases over time. But since they're so big, being old trees, they still produce a lot of acorns from that standpoint. So basically, if you're retaining dominant and co-dominant oak trees in your canopy, you're going to be doing a good job there. And again, if 50 to 60% of the overstored trees are an oak, again, divided between white oak and red oak, that's really a good mix from that standpoint. Part of the management of this too is you might consider doing how to even increase acorn production from trees you already have. So now a forester is going to go in and they'll do a crown release, or sometimes they might refer to this as a crop tree release, where they identify trees that are really valuable from a lumber standpoint, and they're going to release growing space for those so they can grow faster and make you more money. From a wildlife standpoint, we could do the same thing. We can actually do crown releases around good producing acorn trees and actually increase the production of acorns. And so this was a study done a couple years ago, at least published, where they did crown release, and fertilization, as well as just fertilization. And they found that the crown release was by far the most beneficial. Strangely enough, fertilization with crown release actually had a lower rate, not even the same. So that was kind of interesting from that standpoint. So you can actually have some impact from that standpoint. So this might be something to really think about too. If you don't have a lot of oaks in your overstory, then you might want to consider maybe more intensive management around those few oaks that you have to really try and maximize acorn production, at least in the short term, from that standpoint. So a third thing to think about is edge. And so if you look at traditional wildlife management publications, I'm talking back 30, 40, 50 years ago, edge management was really, really focused, right? It was a strong kind of a standard that you did. A lot of the game species that people like, in terms of hunting, like white-tailed deer, eastern cottontail, and some others, they really like those edges where you have one habitat type that's going to be adjacent to another habitat type. So how do we do that? And so these things are basically a little bit different. And so if you look at a lot of the edges that we have in the Midwest, I would call those a very hard, simple edge, right? So you have a woodland next to a cornfield, or a woodland next to a pasture, those kinds of things, where it's a very defined edge and there's not a lot of diversity around that. And so there's a lot of work being done looking at how do we enhance that? And edge feathering is really the primary means by which we do that. And you can think of trying to basically take that very simple edge, and you've got two choices. One is you can maybe do some planting or do some different types of management from the woodland edge out into the field or pasture. Or you can take that woodland edge and go back into the woods and do some thinning, some releases to try and open up that canopy to get more sunlight to the ground. And then you get more stuff, more trees and shrubs and things growing up in that increased sunlight. And so by doing that, you're creating more of a wider ecotone. It's a more complex edge. And this has really been shown to reduce predation effects by things like fox and raccoon on songbirds. It also provides just more habitat for nesting and some of those other things. It provides more food for things like rabbit, for quail. And so those are really important. There was a study done in southwestern Ohio by Ohio State, Bob Gates and some of his students, and they were looking at bobwhite quail in a very fragmented landscape. And they found that the presence of woody cover was really, really critical, the most critical thing in getting bobwhite through winters when they had snowfall. And so by doing this, you can create some really thick cover. And so if you've got some native warm season grasses or old fields and things like that are adjacent to a woodland, you can increase some of that woody cover by doing some edge feathering, particularly if you do some thinning within the edge of that woods. Okay, so something to think about. So there's different ways to do it. You can simply deaden trees. You can cut and bend them. This was from a site down in southern Indiana, not too far from Bloomington, Nashville area, if you're familiar with that. This landowner was interested in songbirds. And so he cut some trees and just fell them out into this field. And so this field is kind of a fallow field. He just let go to annuals and some perennials. And so you can see all this area here. This was a tree. And so all the stuff that grows up in that. And if you walked along that edge, you really had a lot of use of songbirds in there. So those tree canopies are just like a brush pile, essentially. And so they provide good overnight cover for them, roosting cover. And there's also a lot of things for them to eat within there. So it's good from that standpoint. Another thing to think about is these edges is it might be a good opportunity to do your vine management. And so grapevines are one of those things that foresters and wildlife folks really don't see eye to eye. Okay. It's not that one is wrong and one's right. It's just they have different objectives sometimes in terms of that, right? So if you're thinking of timber, which is really valuable, you don't want something like a heavy grapevine weighing it down and increase the potential of having a crown come out of it, the treetop coming out of it during a winter storm or a windstorm or something like that. So they kill these things. The flip side of that is they're really good for wildlife, right? And so one of the recommendations for tree squirrels is you really want about 2 to 4 grapevines per acre on average to really help maximize tree squirrel populations. And so if you're a squirrel hunter or you just like squirrels, grapevines are good. The thing is, though, edges are good for these things because they get more sunlight. And then your valuable crop trees really aren't going to be on the edge because they're limby because they get more sunlight, and so they have limbs farther down the trunk, so they don't have a lot of clean boards to them, and so that's a way to kind of meet your timber goals as well as your wildlife goals. It's kind of a trade-off there. So when you open up these edges, you're going to get a lot of different stuff in there. So a lot of things, in Indiana, we're going to get a lot of dogwood shrubs, viburnum shrubs, things like that. Really dense thickets for wildlife, really great for quail. Pheasants will use them for winter cover sometimes. Certainly good for rabbits and those kinds of things as well. If you've got access lanes close to these thickets, you're going to get turkey broods use them as well. So look at another example of edge feathering in practice. This is actually the Southeast Purdue Ag Center, or at least part of it, down in Southeast Indiana. And so this is actually a feathered edge here. So you can see this field is really linear in shape. And so it really had a problem of drying out and getting good productivity along these edges because it was so thin here that you had so much shade competition there. It was really difficult to really maximize production. And so they went through there and cut out a bunch of things. And so this is on the ground. This is this spot right here. This is that same spot. And so that's what it looked like. Nothing planted here, right? And so this was basically all the overstory trees were removed and you let the stuff come up. One of the challenges with these types of endeavors, though, is, and this is true of anything, is if you're going to open up the canopy, you really need to do invasive species control ahead of time. You're not going to get it all, but at least you make it somewhat manageable. And so every year or two, we have to go through there with some herbicide. We'll maybe do some cut stump treatments of things that we don't want in there that volunteers. And so that's just something to think about. And unfortunately, we all have to deal with on a regular basis now from a land management standpoint. Okay, so edges. Another thing to think about with edges, and so it's an opportunity to do some brush pile management. And so brush piles can be used for a lot of the mammals such as skunks, possums will utilize these things. Sometimes canines will use them, and they'll use them as a den site even. But songbirds will use them as winter roosts as well because they're real thick and the birds of prey can't get them. And certainly, rabbits is probably like the species most people associate with brush piles, but they actually are used by quite a wide variety of different animals. And so if you're doing thinning or canopy removal, you can take all that stuff and just inside the edge of the woods every 200 to 300 feet, you can make a brush pile, right? And so you make these about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And so you're kind of using that material. It's right there next to the site. And so it's really efficient from that standpoint. So that's something to think about too, if you're doing those types of management activities. Okay, so permanent openings. Permanent openings are different than openings we create when we're regenerating trees, right? So I mentioned group selection, clear cuts. those are regeneration openings. The purpose of those is to try and regrow the next crop of trees, essentially, the next forest. Permanent openings are different. They're open all the time, and it's meant that way. So there's a couple ways you can do this. One is you can do it within the context of timber management, right? And so within timber management, you might have log landings, and sometimes people just have these temporarily, but if you can have a log landing that you keep open all the time, it could be valuable, right? And so if it's large enough, you can actually maybe do some planting of a legume or something like that in the opening if it gets enough sun. Usually these things, though, they're small enough where they don't get a lot of sun, and so you're just going to let kind of nature kind of recolonize in a way. And you might keep that open maybe once a year just by using a bush hog or something like that, just to kind of keep the trees at bay. And this would be a permanent opening. Okay. Another example might be some old fields or odd areas you might have on your property, maybe as a part of your woodland, where it's not really a forest per se. It's not really a field. It's just kind of something that maybe might bush hog every now and then or something like that, just to kind of keep it under control. These things can be really valuable to wildlife, right? And so you can imagine something like this, where maybe you bush hogged a lane through it, like a system like that, to allow turkeys to access like all the insects and vertebrate and fruits in here. But certainly, these areas are going to have a lot different stuff in them than they would otherwise. And so we think of all the woody stuff in forest, but if they're not getting sunlight, they're not going to grow, and they're certainly not going to produce a lot of fruit, right? So if you want good fruit production, good soft mass production, you need sunlight. And so that's where these permanent openings, as well as the edges, can really help benefit a lot of species. And it just it adds a little diversity to the landscape. Lots of different things here, brambles, black raspberries, blackberries, viburnums, blackhaw, all those kinds of things, wild plum. All these are used by different species. I wouldn't say one's better than the other. It's always good to just kind of have a diversity of different things out there. And usually a lot of these things are actually going to volunteer because birds are going to deposit what they're feeding on already. So permanent openings. And you should think about having maybe 5 to 10% of the woodlands in permanent opening. 5% is probably more reasonable. Woody debris. And so woods have a lot of dead wood. Okay. And so that's actually pretty valuable to a lot of species of wildlife. I showed this before. So in a timber harvest, you certainly have that, and you create that. Part of the amount of dead wood that's on the ground is really reflective of the age of the forest, right? And so you're going to have a lot more dead wood in old growth, very old stands than you would in very young stands, right? And so there's a lot there, right? But it's not going to last forever. Eventually that stuff's going to decay and be returned to the soil in some fashion, right? And so the age can really affect that, because in an old growth forest, you got stuff dying actually all the time. And so it's actually a pretty continual source of dead material from that standpoint. The other thing to think about is in management activities, we create dead stuff, right? And so in timber harvesting, they're going to cut trees, they're going to bring them up to the yard, they're going to buck them, and the stuff that's not valuable, they're just going to leave there, and they're going to take the good stuff. Well, they don't do anything with them. They just leave them there, right? Because there's no money in doing anything else with them. And so having these wood piles like this, and again, these are going to be on log yards, so they're probably going to be in upland areas. They're really going to be utilized by a lot of different species, and particularly reptiles, right? And so I'll have nest sites of snakes, of lizards that I've found at these sites pretty continually because they're very warm, they have good cover, and again, they're upland sites, and so they're valuable from that standpoint. And this is an eastern fence lizard that's a male during the breeding season. They get that blue color on them. And so a lot of times in those edges, openings like that they have that woody material, you're going to find fence lizards in them. Okay. So again, with the woody material, it's one of those things in your woodlands, if you're just walking through, it's not junk. It's actually valuable and used by different things, chipmunks, white-footed mice, and certainly reptiles and amphibians. And so they do certainly have value. And so sometimes just thinking about just retaining those things instead of, cleaning up your woods. That's something in Indiana we sometimes have to fight with folks, is they don't want their woods to look messy, where some of that stuff, the messy stuff, actually has some value to it. Okay. So snags and den trees. And so that's kind of the sixth thing on our list here. And so a den tree is a live tree that has cavities in it, and a snag is a dead standing tree that's going to likely have cavities in it. Okay, so if you think about those in a group, we have a lot of different species that utilize cavities. And from that standpoint, not only birds, but also a lot of mammals, right? And so we can think of it in those terms. Just some examples of birds, obviously woodpeckers are primary cavity makers. They make the cavities and use them, and then when they abandon them, you'll get other things come in there and use those cavities, and then they're called secondary cavity users. And so again, a lot of different birds will use those. One thing you notice about this list is there's a big difference in terms of the size of those species, right? Tufted titmice, they're little, okay? House wrens are little dinky birds. That's what some of the foresters around here will call them. But other things like barn owls, wood ducks, also barred owls are really big. They utilize cavities, right? And so you need big trees with holes in them, with cavities in them, as well as small trees. So something to think about from that standpoint. Again, we also have mammals that use cavities from that standpoint. Red squirrels are those little piney squirrels. Flying squirrels, that's something that we have a nest box, a cavity box, nest box project in some of our departmental woodlands that are being monitored and things. And so we have several species of bats that utilize tree cavities. Not all of them do. Some of them will roost in leaf litter. Some of them roost up in the overstory of trees, in the leaves of trees, but some of them actually use those cavities as well. So again, sometimes these are made by Mother Nature. So this is a typical pileated or palliated woodpecker tree. This is a sassafras tree. This tree is dead. Then you also have some trees like sycamores that sometimes will lose their limbs, and then you'll have squirrels that'll keep chewing on that opening to keep it open and it's utilized, right? One thing that the research has shown is that we're really not good at identifying and counting cavities from the ground, right? So we can't look at trees and really be very good at saying, okay, that's a good cavity tree. That one's not. That one's got 3 cavities. That one has 2. So we're not good at that. So how do we do this, right? And so we can create some of these things just naturally through some of our activities, right? So if we're doing the crop tree release, we're doing edge feathering, we can just girdle trees or kill them in some other fashion to maintain that, have that snag, that dead standing tree, right? So that's one way we can do that. Another way we can do things is with looking in our woodlands and trying to identify the large trees that are going to have a higher likelihood of having cavities in them as living trees, right? So our oaks, hickories, black gum is another one that's a good cavity tree. So if we identify those trees in our woodlands, we can keep those, right? And so this is kind of a win-win. So this white oak is a really good acorn producer. It's big enough where it's eventually going to have some cavities in it, probably. It also has a lot of large lateral branches, and it's going to be a really good roost tree for wild turkey. And so we might want to think about, well, I'm going to try and release this crown a little bit and increase acorn production on this, and knowing that this is also counts as one of my live den trees, my cavity trees. So you can kind of double up on those kinds of things. There's actually been some research done looking at number of snags per acre of forest. Essentially, you need 1 big one per acre, 4 medium ones per acre, and 2 small ones per acre. My advice to folks is to really focus more on the larger ones, because again, larger cavities are going to be more sparse just because of the age of most of our woodlands. And so focusing on large trees, those larger trees is really, you're going to get more bang for your buck. The other thing with large trees is they're going to have large cavities, but they're also going to have small ones, right? So they have smaller limbs, and sometimes they can break off and you can create cavities that way. And so just kind of something to think about from that standpoint. Understory, right? And so I spent a lot of time talking about overstory, primarily because that's really how we manipulate the amount of sunlight getting to the floor. That's how we manipulate plant succession, and that's how we can get all those kind of different diversity in terms of species composition and structure, right? But the understory is important too, and probably the biggest thing about understory management is going to be deer management. Okay, and so in some areas, white-tailed deer really aren't that big of an issue. There's not a high enough population of them, not enough mouths out there on the landscape where they can do a lot of damage. But if you've got a lot of mouths on the landscape and you don't have a lot of groceries in the fridge, meaning those young forests that provide a lot of food, some of those permanent openings, those kinds of things, then you're going to end up with situations like this, where this is an example of overbrowsing. And the condition you see here as compared to this is white-tailed deer management. This was a state park. This was actually part of some of my master's work a long time ago. But this was McCormick Street State Park in Indiana. And they just started doing the deer reduction hunts soon after this. And this was Morgan Monroe State Forest, just about 20 miles away. And again, you see the difference there. So pretty dramatic from that standpoint. A couple resources, and I'll copy these and put them to the chat when I'm done, or at least provide them to Hank and he can put them in that email, but we'll get you the links to these. But we've got a lot of videos on not only white-tailed deer management, but also a lot of things. And so I'll put the link in there, and it has some good information in terms of harvest data collection. You know, the trick to deer management is, I think everyone kind of understands that harvesting deer on a property is important, and particularly harvesting does, because that's really how you're going to make a difference in terms of the local population level. But the question is, well, how much do you have to do? And so part of it, you can look at the plant community, right? You can look at for browse lines, you can look for indicator species. There's some publications that we just came out with that are actually going to come out with from some of our research, the Indiana Deer Research Project that has some of this information in it. Unfortunately, that's not published yet, but also you can look at the condition of deer. So if you're hunting deer on your property, you can look at age structure, sex ratios, those types of things, and you kind of help put a picture together in terms of, like, maybe I need to harvest more does than what I am, those kinds of things, right? Missouri also has some publications online looking at evaluating habitat for white-tailed deer. And again, I'll add that link to Hank's list as well. Next thing is wetlands and water. And so that's obviously important. A lot of species of wildlife require water for reproduction. They require daily drinking water. Some species actually get their requirements from metabolic processes, dew off of plants, those kinds of things. But having water is certainly going to increase your capacity to have different types of species on your property. No doubt about that. For example, with wild turkey. And so research has shown that wild turkeys tend to nest close in proximity to open water sources, and they'll also have their primary roost trees close to water as well, as opposed to the secondary roost trees. So if you like wild turkey, having water on your property is really important. That's probably going to be a challenge for you in Missouri, depending on what part of the state you're in, right? And so some woodlands are going to have permanent sources of water, some type of a creek or river through there. And certainly that's going to kind of fill that niche per se. Sometimes you might have some seeps on your property that turkeys are going to really be attracted to, those types of things. Some of you might also have vernal pools or ephemeral wetlands or temporary wetlands, depending on the publication or resource you're looking at. They call them different things. But essentially, these are small bodies of water within woods that retain water for only part of the year. So it's good because they don't have fish populations, but they provide breeding habitat for amphibians. Then certainly they could be utilized by woodland bats. Anything that requires open drinking water, they can utilize that. And even things like box turtles will utilize these very heavily during dry times during the summer. And so you'll sometimes, on a project I was involved in years ago, we had radio transmitters on box turtles, and we had a drought year. It was 2012, and we had box turtles move over a mile to Lake Monroe, and they hung out there for about 2 months. And then they returned to their home range, and they never exhibited that behavior again. We never had that extreme drought. And so just kind of interesting from that standpoint. So water is really, really important from that standpoint. And so again, a lot of woodland amphibians, tree frogs, wood frogs, all those kinds of things, as well as our pond breeding salamanders. They not only require those, water habitats, but they need them for reproduction. So it's really, really critical. Now, some of you may not, because of the woodlands that you have, and maybe very, very dry, xeric conditions. And so you might think about ponds, right? And so ponds isn't exactly the same thing as are temporary wetlands, right? And so they're different. In terms of amphibians, you're not really going to have too much except for, say, bullfrogs, green frogs, east newts are able to withstand some pressure from fish and things like that. But you're certainly going to have things like maybe painted turtles or red-eared sliders, some of those kinds of things. And certainly any kind of a mammal that requires drinking water can utilize something like that. So they definitely do have their place. They're not exactly the same thing in terms of function of wetlands, but they certainly can be beneficial from a wildlife standpoint. Undesirables. And so this could be taken a number of different ways, but the way I'm going to take it is with invasive species. And I touched on this before, and I really want to touch on it again in that opening the canopy, if you've got very uniformity in the age of your woodlands, doing some management on the edges or within the interior and creating some openings to get some that structural diversity, that age diversity is really valuable to wildlife standpoint. But if you've got invasive species that are already there, you're just going to create habitat for them. Okay. And so this is an understory. This is a typical scene, unfortunately, in a lot of Indiana. And this is in the fall, late October, early November, where you get bush honeysuckle is still very visible in the understory. It's almost solid bush honeysuckle, and it's a problem. So if we did an overstory removal in a condition like this, I'm just going to release bush honeysuckle, and it's going to be problematic for that. So if I'm going to do any management, I'm going to have to go through and kill this first before I do open that up. It's a lot of work. Fortunately, there's cost share money available for that. There certainly is in Indiana. I would imagine the same is true in Missouri. And so it's just one of those things I really want to remind folks of. So a couple things to kind of close on, just thoughts from that standpoint, is that there's always going to be trade-offs, right? So anything that you do from a management standpoint, you're always going to benefit some species. You're going to decrease the quality of habitat for other species, or maybe even make it unusable for a period of time. And then some species you're probably not going to have an effect on at all, right? And so it just really depends on what your goals are. So no negative effects shouldn't really be your goal. It's not reasonable, right? I'll give you an example. So there was a study published from Pennsylvania years ago, and I don't remember the exact date, but they were looking at the impacts of harvesting on frogs and toads, on salamanders, woodland salamanders, and also snakes. Okay. And so they did it by basal area. And so in different stands, they measured basal area. And so basically, the more basal area you had, the better it was for salamanders. In fact, there was a minimum of, I think, 60 or 63 was the score, or something like that. Don't quote me on that. I'm just doing that from memory, right? So if you just look at that study, it's like, whoa, open up the canopy is not good because it's bad for salamanders, right? You don't find them there as much. Reptiles was the opposite. And that makes sense, right? It's because they bask. A lot of the things they eat, things like small mammals and stuff, they actually benefit from those practices. And so if you just did that, you think like, oh, we just need to open everything up because it benefits snakes, even though I realize not a lot of people like snakes. And then anerns, it made no difference at all. Frogs and toads, their presence in the stand was solely based on the presence of water within that stand or the adjacent stand. Okay, so you really got to look at things more holistically and from a wildlife perspective. And that really kind of goes well within the next thing. And so anytime we talk to private landowners, the first thing we want you to do is identify what are your land management objectives. Not only wildlife, what other things do you do? Because those things go hand in hand. If you're using your property for different uses, you really need to have those well-defined objectives. And the next step then is to create a plan, right? So I've outlined a lot of different things, possibilities. From that standpoint, some of them might be right for you. Some of them may not be right for you. That's perfectly fine. But as long as you have like a management plan, have something to follow, that's really going to increase the success of what you do and really kind of keep that long-term vision in mind, right? And then the last part of that is seeking professional advice. And there's really no substitute of getting a professional forester or wildlife biologist on your property, having them walk the property, talk about these kinds of things, because every situation is unique. And so having that one-on-one guidance is really, really valuable. So I encourage folks to take care of that opportunity if you have the opportunity to do so. Okay, so I think that is it.